If I take away the miracles, does your Buddha survive? Good, because tonight the stones get the microphone. For 2,000 plus years, biography has been embalmed in legend. Lotus footfalls, talking trees, cosmic confirmations, beautiful, yes, and useless if you want history that holds up outside a sermon. Enter the only witness that doesn't care about doctrine, rock, specifically a polished sandstone pillar planted by a remorseful emperor who turned a continent's politics into a sermon, Ashoka. On that pillar at Lumbini, the text is blunt. The king came to the Buddha's birthplace, marked it, cut the local tax, and left an inscription nobody could misquote. That's not a parable, that's a receipt. Here's the scandal. Archaeology shrinks the fog without erasing the mystery. Pillars, bricks, and stratigraphy don't tell you whether devas bowed or snakes became benches. They tell you where people actually walked, prayed, and spent money. Lumbini wasn't a meme. It was a pilgrimage economy by the 3rd century BCE. Shrines, monks, donors, rules. The pillar says so, the ground says so, the tax break says so. Myth gives you ore, evidence gives you coordinates. And yes, dates are messy. The Buddha's lifetime is still debated. Late 6th to early 5th century BCE ranges survive because ancient calendars fought and scribes disagreed. Adults can hold that ambiguity without collapsing into nothing is knowable. Uncertainty isn't a bug, it's the price of honesty about old things. What matters is that by the Mauryan period, a memory of a real teacher had addresses, places you can step on today and feel the grooves of a long-worn path. Pillars don't do theology, they do location. So here's our pact. For 8 parts, we'll separate what stone can carry from what story embellishes. Not to sneer at legend, I love myth, it moves blood, but to stop treating ornament as oxygen. If your faith requires inflated claims, you will always fear evidence. My Dharma isn't afraid of daylight. I'll give you the receipts. You decide what remains sacred when the glitter is gone. History's first cold open. Ashoka visits Lumbini, orders a pillar, and has carved that the Blessed One was born here. Not somewhere, not once upon a time, here. He then grants a fiscal privilege, remitting taxes or reducing them to a token share, because when a king kneels, a district's ledger changes. That single inscription collapses miles of speculation into a few lines of prakrit, pilgrimage, policy, place. Even UNESCO, the least edgy institution on earth, summarizes the claim plainly. This is the bedrock against which every documentary leans. Zoom out. Ashoka's edicts on pillars and rock faces from India to Nepal to Afghanistan are our earliest public broadcast of a ruler aligning statecraft with Buddhist ethics. They don't prove suttas, they prove patronage and the spread of Buddhist identity by the mid-3rd century BCE. Think of them as imperial push notifications against cruelty, for restraint, for generosity, and yes, for sanctifying places into networks that pilgrims could follow. Somewhere between tax codes and Dharma slogans, Buddhism left fingerprints you can still touch. Another nearby pillar at Nigali Sagar records the enlargement of the stupa of the past Buddha Kanakamuni, evidence that by Ashoka's time Buddhism already looked back across imagined ages, building layers of memory into stone. That is what institutions do. They ritualize, they renovate, they inscribe, which means your task isn't to pick between pure enlightenment and mere politics, it's to see how a liberation teaching colonized space, roads, wells, courtyards, shrines, and turn them into a map that outlived empires. That map begins, for us, with the loudest and clearest voice we have, a pillar pointing to a birth site and a king who put money where myth had stood. If you've been living on vibes and parables, this may feel like sacrilege. It isn't. It's craft, honouring the places humans tied their hopes to with words no priest could quietly edit later. But was there anything before Ashoka's PR? In 2013, a team led by Robin Conningham dug below the brick horizon at the Maya Devi temple in Lumbini and reported post holes and a central void suggesting an early tree shrine with radiocarbon samples nudging toward the 6th century BCE. If right, that hints at a cult place pre-Ashoka, a proto-shrine whose later brick dress Ashoka standardized. For once, rumour of origins wasn't just a monk's memory, it looked like a stratigraphic story. Caveat, because grown-ups love caveats, scholars pushed back. Some argued the wooden features could be non-Buddhist or their dates too coarse to prove a shrine tied to the historical Buddha. Others noted how often the earliest brick sanctuaries imitate timber, so wood first, brick later isn't shocking. Proving Buddhist use that early is the hard part. Translation: promising signal, not a verdict. Beware headlines that turn one trench into final truth. Why does this matter? Because it shows the right way to hold origin stories. Let them breathe inside evidence, not outside it. If a wooden precinct gathered people before the emperor's visit, then Buddhism didn't appear as a royal brand. The brand found a beating local practice and codified it. That's how religions survive, not by diktat alone, but by marrying empire to habit. The irony is delicious. Archaeology, used with care, rescues what legend wanted, continuity, but cleans it of miracle inflation. I don't need a tree that talks. I need a hole in the ground where a tree stood, ringed by footprints of people who kept coming back. Hold the tension. A cautious maybe beneath a confident pillar. That's adulthood in the history of religion. Here's a twist most documentaries whisper. For centuries after the Buddha's death, devotees often refused to show him. Early art points to empty thrones, footprints, a Bodhi tree or a wheel, presence by absence. Then, in the first centuries BCE, something flips. In Gandhara and Mathura, the Buddha appears in the flesh, draped like a Mediterranean sage in one region, like an Indian ascetic in another. It's an artistic revolution, from aniconic suggestion to iconic portrait, from symbol to face. That isn't doctrine mutating, it's cultures cross-pollinating under new patrons and empires, Indo-Scythians, Kushans. Art history is our second witness that Buddhism evolves as it travels. Why should you care? Because the aniconic iconic shift is the X-ray of a broader truth. Buddhism has always been a machine for translation. If you mistake a particular costume for the essence, you'll turn living practice into museum glass, or worse, into an identity cult. The Gandharan Buddha's wavy hair and toga-like folds aren't westernizing corruption. They're what happens when a Dharma learns new grammar without losing its verbs. The message survives because the medium adapts. Archaeology plus art history together give you a Buddha who moves, born into a specific North Indian ecology, then reframed by empires, artisans, and roads. Myths tell you he glowed. Stones tell you where and when people gathered around his memory. Statues tell you how they imagined his body. Between them you can walk a path that doesn't require you to switch off your brain to keep your heart. Archaeology gives you receipts, texts give you voices. Treat either as absolute and you get fantasy texts only, or amnesia stones only. Here's the sober map. What stone can say? By the mid-3rd century BCE, Buddhism had fixed addresses and imperial backing. Ashoka's pillar at Lumbini marks a birth site and even records a tax remission for the district, evidence of pilgrimage economies, not parables. Ashoka's network network of edicts, rock and pillar, spreads a public ethic and ties distant sites into a recognizable Buddhist geography. At Bodh Gaya, UNESCO notes an early temple credited to Ashoka. The Vajrasana diamond throne beneath the Bodhi tree is Mauryan in date, an aniconic focus that people knelt before long before lifelike statues took over. What texts can and can't say. The Pali Canon wasn't written down in the Buddha's lifetime. Theravada chronicles place its first full writing in Sri Lanka around the 1st century. BCE, Aluvihara, 4th Council. That's centuries after the Buddha, but still very early by world religion standards. Our earliest physical Buddhist manuscripts are often Ganda, Karosth, birch bark scrolls from circa 1st century before Common Era to 1st century CE, a window into scripture before later redactions standardized Pali and Sanskrit canons, the honest middle. Texts preserve teaching and ritual memory, stone anchors where, when large numbers acted on that memory. The canon's oral formation and later writing mean we should expect layers, core formulas plus later commentary. Archaeology can't tell you what the Buddha meant, but it can tell you who invested, where they gathered, and how early those investments start showing up. That's enough to weed out fairy dust and still leave a teacher whose words moved kings, merchants, and monks hard enough to carve policy into rock. If your devotion needs identical certainty from both stone and scripture, you're asking different instruments to play the same note. Let each play what it's built for and listen to the harmony instead of forcing a solo. To see how myth turns into infrastructure, follow the pillars. Ashoka doesn't prove nirvana, he proves roads. Birthplace, Lumbini. The inscription says the quiet part loud. The king visited, marked the spot, and changed tax policy for a sacred zone. Pilgrimage is now public law. Enlightenment, Bodh Gaya. UNESCO records the first temple there as Ashokan 3rd century before Common Era. The Vajrasana, a polished Mauryan slab under the Bodhi tree, served as an empty throne for devotion. Early Buddhists were often aniconic, venerating seats, trees, footprints, not portraits. First teaching, Sarnath, the lion capital crowning Ashoka's Sarnath pillar, is now India's national emblem, proof of how thoroughly the Buddhist memory got bolted into civic identity. Pillar lists show Sarnath among major Ashokan installations. Past Buddhas, Nigali Sagar. A nearby pillar commemorates enlargement of Kanakamuni's stupa, evidence that by Ashoka's day Buddhists already curated a deep past, building time into stone. This is the point. By the 3rd century BCE, Buddhism isn't just sermons, it's sites, routes and budgets. Ashoka's broadcast of Dhamma is also an urban planning project. If you want to know what people really believed, don't only read what they said, watch what they built and how they travelled to touch it. Let's be adults about dates and miracles. Dates. Traditional chronicles and even UNESCO signage sometimes cite 623 BCE as the Buddha's birth. Modern scholarship widens the window. After decades of debate, Bechet's Symposium, Oxford, Stanford entries, many scholars cluster the death around circa 400 BCE, give or take approximately 20 years, with lifespans back calculated from Ashoka's coronation, circa 268 BCE translation. There is no single sacred number, there is a range. The 2013 Lumbini excavations that proposed a pre-Ashokan timber shrine, possibly 6th century BCE, are intriguing yet contested. Helpful signal, not final verdict. Miracles, archaeology won't certify devas bowing, lotuses blooming underfoot, or omniscient glances. It also won't disprove them. Material evidence can show density of devotion and chronologies of space. It cannot arbitrate metaphysics. If you need stone to vote for the supernatural, you'll force it to lie. If you need stone to kill the sacred, you'll misuse its silence. How to live with it. Treat myth as meaning work, not minutes of a meeting. Treat archaeology as boundary conditions. It tells you which stories can't be true, wrong place, time, and which don't need inflation because the footprint is already massive. Let uncertainty be a spiritual discipline. If the Dharma collapses when a date shifts by 50 years, you weren't holding the Dharma. You were clutching a calendar. Next time you stand at Lumbini or Bodh Gaya, run this 4-step. Ask the stone question. What is the oldest secure layer here? At Lumbini, Ashoka's pillar plus edict equals 3rd century BCE. At Bodh Gaya, Ashokan temple horizon plus Vajrasana. Touch what we know before you float in what we tell. Name the unknowables. Say out loud, we do not have the Buddha's autograph. We have later manuscripts, Gandhar scroll circa, 1st century BCE/CE, Pali Canon written down circa 1st century before Common Era. Then breathe. Your reverence just became adult. Honor the work. Notice the empire scale coordination that turned sermons into roads and ritual calendars. Ashoka's network is itself a teaching. Compassion that builds. Keep 2 altars. On one put evidence, dates, layers, inscriptions. On the other put meaning. The vow you're renewing by coming here. Neither has to conquer the other. The Buddha doesn't need your superstition. He needs your integrity. If stones make you cynical, you weren't looking. If stories make you gullible, you weren't listening. Let them argue inside you until a third thing appears. Reverence that doesn't fear daylight. That's the only kind that survives both time and truth.